So this is session number 5 now, and I just have a quick announcement before we get started. There were two sessions that were reserved at the end, the 6th weekend, and we have decided that the topic of education, we will have that session on 12th June or 11th for people in Western countries. So you can look at the calendar, the schedule in the emails, and that one is now updated to accommodate this additional session. With that, sir, we can please get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. There is an article by Krishnamurti, which is a chapter of the book Krishnamurti on Education, published by Krishnamurti Foundation of India, I think sometime in the 1970s. And this talk is an expansion of that chapter. If I can locate that chapter on the internet, because I have the book, but I don't know whether it's on the internet, then I will send it to all the participants. He says there that the scientific mind and the religious mind are the two great quests of humanity for truth. The scientific mind is exploring the truth about how nature functions and finds that nature has a tremendous order. Not only nature as forests and rivers and so on in the earth, but as the whole universe. And because there is that order, scientists try to determine the laws governing that order. And that is the purpose, basic purpose of science. The basic science is physics, which deals with how the universe originated and how it developed and so on. It leads to chemistry, and chemistry leads to biology. So these subjects used to be separate subjects when I was a student, but now it has all become one continuum of science. But it begins with the scientific method and the scientific mind. The scientific mind is called the scientific temper. It refers to certain values which have to be observed while doing science. We will study those values because that's the scientific spirit as distinct from the scientific method. And similarly, there is the religious spirit and the religious methods, namely the techniques of meditation, the various rituals and so on, which is the form of religion. But the main purpose of religion or the religious quest is to come upon virtue in consciousness. And virtue, it was pointed out way back by Socrates about 2000 years ago, that virtue is a state of order in consciousness. If I may quote him, he said, there is only one virtue, and that is order in consciousness. And to come upon it, you have to engage in self-knowledge. He called it know thyself. So there has been this long legacy of religious inquiry with a religious mind. You find it in the Upanishads, which are more than 3,000 years old. You find mention of it in the Gita, which is also more than 3,000 years old. And Buddha, who was a historical figure, gave tremendous importance to self-knowledge. Indeed, both he and Socrates in the West said that is the higher form of knowledge. And the knowledge of the world is the lower form of knowledge. So this is a very old quest. And the teachers who engaged in it did not create the religions. The religions came later on. They were made by the followers. So the temples or the churches and the mosques and all that were developed subsequently. They were not the main concern of the teacher. He gave the teaching, which is the essence of religion, which is the wisdom of the teacher. So way back in the 13th century, a Japanese philosopher, sage, named Basho, said, don't try to follow the wise. Go after the wisdom he is talking of. So historically, for a long time, this religious inquiry has existed. The scientific inquiry, in the sense of modern science, is more recent, starting from Galileo's time in the 15th century, 16th century. Before that, science was also done only through thinking. And there was no division between science and religion or science and spirituality. You find people like Leonardo da Vinci, Pythagoras, Socrates, the Greeks, Aristotle, even Newton is supposed to have written more papers on religion than on science. The division between science and religion arose in the 16th century because some of the discoveries of Galileo contradicted the beliefs of the Christian church. Till then, they thought of the solar system with the earth as the center and said everything else moves around the earth. In perfect circles. That was Ptolemy's model, started in the 2nd century AD. So from 2nd century till 15th century, that was the belief held. And that was what the church adopted. Also because it tallied with some statements in the Bible, that the earth is at the center. And Galileo's findings supported a different model given by Copernicus a few hundred years before, where he said that the sun is at the center of the solar system and the planets are all rotating around it. Because Galileo's, who worked in Italy, in Pisa, his findings supported the Copernican model, which opposed the views of the Christian church. He was persecuted. Unfortunately, in Christianity, inquiry was not promoted. Belief was promoted, and anybody who questioned the belief was persecuted, put on the stake. So Galileo was also arrested and forced to recant that it was a mistake to support this. So he recanted in order to, in his old age. It's a famous court case, and it says that at the end, when the case was over and he had been given warnings and so on, as he was leaving, he whispered, "And yet it moves." That means you may persecute me, but the truth is not changed by that. And when he was in prison, he smuggled a book out which was published in Holland. And from that time, modern science began because he laid emphasis on experiment and observation. Before that, people used to discuss theoretically only through thinking whether a big stone will fall to the ground first or a small stone will fall first, and all kinds of arguments and so on. And I don't know if it is true, but the folklore is that Galileo climbed up the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped a big stone and a small stone and showed that both of them fall together. And then said, when one experiment can mean more than 1,000 arguments. So from that time, science began to value experimentation. And modern science, I mean, Galileo is considered to be the father of modern science. Now the scientific method has been perfected, and I will presently show in detail. I have a PowerPoint on which I'll show what that scientific method is. And according to that, one has to determine whether something is true or false. Any theory has to be tested according to that. It is not accepted on authority, so it has to be tested through experiment and observation. Values are not a subject matter of science, but the way science is done and the scientific method is followed includes certain values in it, which is what is called the scientific spirit. And the scientific spirit is very close to what Krishna has said should be the approach for religious inquiry, that it should be based on observation, that nothing should be held sacrosanct which is not questioned, and that truth must be actually perceived in one's everyday life, which is akin to doing an experiment within oneself. So though the scientific method is not applicable to religious inquiry because it is based on measurement, and you cannot measure things in consciousness, the scientific approach is applicable and is very similar to Krishnamurti's approach to the religious quest. So let me share my screen with you and show you some of the slides I have on the PowerPoint. Before doing that, I want to show you a picture of Krishnamurti, which was about how he looked in 1957 when I first saw him. There. That's what he looked like when I first heard him in 1957 in Delhi. Exactly that dress, that manner of sitting and talking is what I had witnessed. I now go to the PowerPoint. Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir, we can see the screen.
Okay. Rohan, how do I enlarge this?
Sir, if you right click on the slide on the left, or there is, yeah, right where your pointer is right now at the bottom, there is a presentation mode, I think. Do you see right hand side bottom, the last icon before the plus and minus signs? Yeah, just before that, the one on the left. Yeah.
So I enlarge it.
Or you could put it into a presentation mode.
Oh. Is this the presentation mode?
Yes, sir.
Slideshow, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you see the whole slide or are the pictures interfering?
No, sir, we can see the slide.
Okay. So I've said the scientific approach to understanding nature and determining the cosmic order of nature is to posit reality as the unknown. Always remember that science doesn't deal with reality. Science posits reality as the unknown and deals with a certain model, which is a conjecture about that reality. In order to understand any phenomenon, it begins with observation of that phenomenon. So planets were observed, and their time period was measured, their distance was measured, and so on. So observation, which includes measurement, and then you tabulate all that, and you look for empirical correlations between two different quantities. So, for instance, in electric current, they had that the voltage is proportional to the current, or vice versa, called Ohm's law for a conductor. So those were empirical correlations, and they were called laws because they didn't understand the physics behind it. But now we don't call them laws. Now we know that there are only 4 force laws on which everything else can be derived. So the next step is to guess an underlying model of reality. That's where the ingenuity of the scientist comes in. And in theory, the scientist is always dealing with a model of reality, not with reality. Where he deals with reality is in experiment. But in theory, he is dealing with an imaginary model of the underlying reality. So you find that they talk about the model of the universe, the model of an atom, the model of a solid, the model of a liquid, and so on. These models are imaginary models, and one can test whether how far they approximate to reality. So to that model, which one has guessed, they apply the laws already known, they apply logic, and a peculiar form of logic called mathematics evolved by the human mind. And it's a great mystery even today as to why that logic called mathematics applies in nature, why nature follows mathematics. But because it does so, that's why science has progressed, physics has progressed rapidly so much. Otherwise, it would not have progressed that much. Galileo, in fact, said that God wrote the universe in the alphabet of mathematics. So it's a great mystery that this order called mathematics, which is evolved by the human mind, finds application in nature. Applying all this, the scientist develops a theory, and from that theory, he makes further predictions that if this model is correct, then this must be so, this must be so, this must be so, and so on. To test that, they go back to experiments, make observations, and try to verify whether that model is correct or not. Now, 3 possibilities arise. Either you get an approximately correct result, not telling exactly, but to a large extent with the observed values. Then you know that your model is an approximation, and you can refine it to make it closer to reality. The other is, no, they don't tally at all. The theoretical predictions do not tally with the observed results. In that case, you have to reject the model and start all over again and guess a new model. So I have said below that science always goes with successive approximations to reality. It never actually perceives reality. It always treats reality as the unknown. Now, there is great humility in that. that we don't know the truth. So for example, we don't really know what the electron is. Sometimes it behaves like a particle. So there was the particle model. And sometimes it behaves like a wave. And you use the wave model. So people ask, how can the same entity be a particle, something like a cricket ball, and a wave like the sea wave or wave on the string of a violin? The answer is, don't try to imagine that entity. The human mind is too conditioned by its experience to actually perceive the reality. We have never observed anything which is both a particle and a wave. And therefore, we are not able to, we have this question in our mind. So they follow instead mathematics. In mathematics, you can put in both the wave component and the particle component into the equation and solve the equation, and it gives correct results. So we don't really know what an electron is. We have two models, which are almost seem to be contradictory to each other. Now, in doing this, there are certain scientific values which I show in this slide, which are a description of the scientific spirit. Any good scientist doing science has to work in this spirit, with this spirit. What are the elements of this spirit? First, posit reality as the unknown. Your theory, your imagination is not reality. Second, rely on inquiry, observation, and questioning. Third, doubt all conclusions. Have an open mind. What you think is true may not be true. Do not accept something on authority and respect dissent. The greatest scientists have been those who have dissented and who have brought about revolutions in science. And there is a very beautiful book written by Thomas Kuhn. This was his PhD thesis in MIT, which is on the structure of scientific revolutions. And it talks about how the data is collected in a particular paradigm by a large number of scientists until a scientist comes up who has a deeper insight and who completely revolutionizes our view on that topic. And that's the revolution. So for instance, relativity is completely different from the classical physics. And then quantum mechanics is another big transition. So it's change of paradigm. And this is akin to what Krishnaji calls insight, which will bring about transformation of consciousness. There is a parallel there. Fifth, demand evidence, proof, reason. Don't accept without doing this, however great the scientist may be. So this non-acceptance of authority is also central to Krishnaji's teaching. Now in science, there is objectivity. That means the thing I am observing is separate from me. And they try to eliminate the observer by having several observers repeat that experiment. And it's only when everybody demonstrably finds the same result that it becomes part of science. That's a limitation that science has accepted, the limitation of objectivity, which means it eliminates the observer. And the limitation is that therefore it cannot study the observer. Whereas the religious quest studies the observer. Here, the observer is set aside. The observer can be simply an instrument. It need not be a living person. So there is great stress on objectivity, whereas the religious quest is very subjective. You are watching your own consciousness and trying to understand that. The results which you get, if they are independent of your conditioning, may be universal, but not everybody shares them. Seventh, universality, that the truths that you arrive at through your experiments and so on is independent of time and space. That means the laws of nature have remained the same and are applicable all through the universe. The same laws. So although you discover them in your laboratory, it tells you also how things are happening on the sun or how they happened 1 million years ago or 1 billion years ago and so on. So the truth is independent of time and space. That's an assumption in science. Someday if we find that it is not true, it will go away. But till now, it has held this universality. Krishnaji is saying that also about religious truths. He's saying if you come upon the truth, you have understood all human consciousness, because your consciousness does not function differently from that of another human being. It may be different in detail, but the essence of it is the same. We'll come to it later. Eighth, which is an important thing in science, is reproducibility. It cannot be that one day I had a vision and I saw something and I cannot reproduce that again. It should be reproducible, it should be explainable to all humanity, and other people doing that should be able to perceive that. Otherwise, it doesn't become part of science. Ninth, there is an international dialogue going on about this. So I do some experiment, I put my results, I publish them in a journal. That journal is read all over the world. Anyone else whom I have never met working in his laboratory and testing the results can repeat that experiment and write his own results criticizing what I have done. And I read that criticism and I look at my results in the context of what he has said. And this kind of international dialogue is going on between thousands of scientists all over the world who don't know each other. But this is only possible because they posit the truth as the unknown, and each one is trying to find that truth. We will see tomorrow in my talk on the dialogue as described by Krishnamurti as a means of joint religious inquiry, that there are similarities with this, that you have to posit the truth as the unknown and not accept anybody's view. And there is no hierarchy. You have to discuss, you can discuss your perceptions, listen to the questions of the other friend of yours, and conduct your own experiments in your own consciousness in daily life, and come back to the dialogue group and tell what you have found without asserting that that is the truth. So something similar is going on in the scientific quest. And the 10th and the last I have put is that there is only one science. It's not Christian truth and Hindu truth and Chinese truth and so on. No, there is only one truth. Either the stone is attracted by the earth or it is not attracted. It cannot be that it is attracted for the Indian and not attracted for the American. So there is only one science, and we must question why, if this quest is the essence of religion, why we have so many different religions, and we talk about Christian truth and Hindu truth and so on. Isn't that truth about consciousness also universal, one and for everybody? And it's only because of one's conditioning, which is a very limited accident of birth, that one perceives it differently from the other human being. So I like this definition of science given by Feynman, who was a Nobel laureate and a scientist at University of California, Los Angeles. He says science is a body of knowledge, some of which is nearly certain, some rather uncertain, but none of it completely certain. That is tremendous humility. None of it completely certain, because so many times we have found that we were feeling that we have come to the end of knowledge and understood the working of the world, and then there was a new discovery which pointed out that what we knew was very partial, and that there was a lot more to be learned and known. So that is going on even today. Even this theory of the Big Bang and the universe is being questioned because there are things like dark energy and dark matter about which in the last decade or so they have detected that we know nothing about that, and it exists in this universe. And all that we know is about 5% of the total matter in the universe. So that lot of uncertainty and nothing that is completely certain. So that is the scientific spirit in which one works. Now, some of the scientists, of course, have also been interested in philosophy. And in fact, science was a branch of philosophy, because philosophy is the quest for truth. That's why when we do scientific research, we are awarded a PhD, and PhD means Doctor of Philosophy. So right from those days, science was part of philosophy. So Galileo says mathematics is the alphabet with which God has written the universe. Heisenberg, who has contributed greatly to quantum mechanics in modern science, says science points to some central design, some definite purpose in the universe. Einstein says the religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogma and theology. Covering both the natural and the spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of things natural and spiritual as a meaningful unity. And that's why David Bohm engaged greatly in dialogue with Krishnamurti to bring this kind of science which is not contradictory to religion. Schumacher says the modern experiment to live without religion has failed. You know, secularism in the West particularly is defined as no religion, complete materialism. And he is saying that that has failed. And lastly, Schrödinger, the man who gave wave mechanics, which was a precursor to quantum mechanics, made this statement, which I personally consider extremely valuable. He says, I consider science as an integrating part of our endeavor to understand the one great philosophical question which embraces all others. Who are we? I consider this not one of the tasks, but the task of science, the only one that counts. So he's saying science is not separate from the religious inquiry because both matter and consciousness exist and therefore they are part of a single reality. And if we are to answer who are we have to answer both how the body came, how the atoms in the body came into their positions, and also what is consciousness. So more recently, in the last 10 years or so, scientists have created what is called a Galileo Commission, which wants to go beyond materialism and investigate consciousness also scientifically. You can Google it, the Galileo Commission, and you will find that scientists are trying to go beyond the limitations of science. Otherwise, with the existing scientific method, you can't study consciousness phenomena because they are not measurable. And the scientific method depends mainly on measurement. Some quotations from Albert Einstein. This is a very famous one. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. So you need these hand in hand, both wisdom and knowledge. One needs both. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Why should it be comprehensible to the human mind? That's what he is asking. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion which stands in the cradle of all true art and science. And that is the origin of both the scientific quest and the religious quest. They have both originated from this innate inquiry which is there in the human consciousness. We don't create it. We may direct it in a particular direction, but the human consciousness in the course of biological evolution is the first consciousness that really explores and wants to understand every mystery and questions it. So it's the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of all true art and science. It is, when he says it's in fact nothing short of a miracle that the modern methods of instruction have not yet entirely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry. For this delicate plant, aside from stimulation, stands mainly in the need of freedom. So he says if education just answers all questions and you memorize them, then it has very little value. So you have to create this learning mind, which is exploring, both in the academic field and in the religious field. Everything is determined by forces over which we have no control. It is determined for the insect as well as for us human beings, vegetables or cosmic dust. We all dance to a mysterious tune intoned in the distance by an invisible pied piper. These are religious feelings which he got while doing his science. And here is Krishnamurti's statement on the religious mind. The religious mind has no beliefs. It has no dogmas. It moves from fact to fact. And therefore, the religious mind is the scientific mind. But the scientific mind is not the religious mind. The religious mind includes the scientific mind, but the mind trained in the knowledge of science is not a religious mind. He said that in Paris 1961, talk number 9. I'll discuss more before I come to the conclusions, but I'll give you the conclusion now because science is a quest for discovering the order that manifests itself in the external world around us. Religion, or the religious quest, is a quest for discovering order in the internal world of our consciousness. They are two complementary quests for truth, and about two aspects of a single reality which includes both matter and consciousness. Antagonism or contradiction between them is the product of a narrow vision, a mistake in understanding. Mainly the mistake is that, especially in the West, they equate religion with belief. And religion is not belief. It is this inquiry. Technology is a byproduct of the scientific quest. Orthodox religions are the byproduct of religious inquiry. Now, technology is not the aim of the scientific quest. The scientific quest's aim is to find the truth about nature. The knowledge of that is then applied by people to make gadgets, to make aeroplanes, to make railway trains and so on. All that is technology. But that's not the aim of the scientific quest. Now, this was brought out very beautifully in a lecture that Faraday gave when he discovered electromagnetism. He demonstrated in a big hall that if you take a coil of wire connected to a galvanometer, which measures current, and push a magnet towards the center of it, it develops electric current in it, and the galvanometer shows deflection. Till then, people thought magnetism and electricity are unconnected to each other, completely separate forces. It was the first demonstration that that is not so, that they are connected to each other. So at the end of his talk, someone in the back of the hall asked a question. He said, all this is very well, but of what use is this discovery? And his answer, which has become a classic in the annals of history of science, was, it's a newborn child. Of what use is a newborn child? So he was not doing the research or finding out the mystery of science, of magnetism and electricity. In order to produce these internet and loudspeakers and cars and everything that operates now using his discovery. But that was not the reason. So that is the difference, that technology is a byproduct of the scientific quest, not the aim of the thing. Similarly, the orthodox religions are byproducts of the religious inquiry. They are not the aim of the religious inquiry. They are being constructed by followers who wanted to simplify things for other people and form a group and so on. And that's how the orthodox religions originated. Indeed, for a long time, there was no worship and no temples and so on. It was around 200 AD or so that the Bhakti movement started and all this came into existence. Before that, religion meant only inquiry. In Buddha's time, it meant essentially this inquiry, and also in the Upanishadic stage. So now, having said that, I want to raise the question as to why it is that science has progressed so rapidly. And we now live in a scientific world, scientific society. And the religious quest has not progressed very much. There are some innate differences which makes for the greater difficulty of the religious quest. First of all, in nature, the order already exists. You are only studying something that already exists and you are trying to describe it. In the religious quest, order doesn't exist in consciousness. You have to come upon it by ending the disorder. And the ending of the disorder requires the perception of what is true and what is false. Because it is the false that creates the disorder. So that is Krishnamurti's teaching, that disorder arises out of illusions in our mind. And because it arises out of illusions, it can be ended, because you can't end facts of nature. You can only end imaginary things by discovering that they are false, because once you know it is false and its consequences are devastating, it ends. It can be changed. Your thinking can be changed. And that requires an insight into and freedom from the conditioning in the mind. So that is, you come upon order through the ending of disorder. The order doesn't already exist. That's one major difference between the scientific quest and the religious quest. The other is that knowledge is very useful in the scientific quest. We now learn everything that Newton did and other scientists during his time did in about 3 years in the bachelor's degree. And then you move on to the master's degree and you study what relativity and quantum mechanics did and so on. So you build continuously on the work of the previous people. So knowledge is helpful. You don't have to repeat everything that Newton did. You can read it quickly and understand, especially learn the mathematics of it. And even if you don't have the insight, which Newton and Einstein and so on had in the about the universe or space, time and matter and energy, you can use the mathematics and it works. So the knowledge works. In the religious quest, the knowledge is ashes. You can read all the scriptures and you will become a professor of theology or professor of Buddhism and so on. But that does not transform your consciousness. It does not create order in consciousness. That's why the professor of philosophy is in his consciousness not different from the ordinary man. The sage is different because the sage has transformed his consciousness. And that's the difference between having the knowledge of the truth and the perception of the truth. So that's another difficulty of the religious quest. And then we mentioned one, that it is very difficult to be objective because you are watching yourself and the observer is not separate from the observed. And therefore the interference of the observer in the observation is very deep In science, it is not so deep. When I am looking at a pendulum and trying to understand how it works and its time period and so on, I am quite separate from the pendulum. And I don't have to project my desires and so on into my observation. But when I am looking at my own consciousness, the observer is not separate from the observed. And there is very intense interaction between the observer and the observation. To be free of this coloration of the conditioning of the observer is a great difficulty in the religious quest, but not so in the scientific quest. So all these reasons exist why the scientific quest is much easier to perform than the religious quest. Moreover, we have not been very intelligent about the religious quest. We have created different religions, accepted their definition as religion, accepted belief as religion. Belief is anathema to inquiry. It kills all inquiry. If you already believe something and you are not willing to question it, you can't progress beyond that. It's part of your condition. Suppose the scientists had done the same. Suppose they had created a temple to Newton and said, we are all Newtonians. Newton is our hero. And we have this temple of Newton where we go and pray to Newton. And other scientists had said, no, we are Einsteinians, and created a temple to Einstein and said, Einstein is our hero, and we have a different flag and so on. Would we have accepted them as scientists? No, we would have said, what is it about nature that you have discovered or found? It has nothing to do with your belief, with your making a temple and worshipping and all that. But in the religious quest, we have been very foolish. We have accepted all this as religion and engaged in it and created divisions within humanity. Instead of positing the truth as the unknown and treating it as a universal thing, we have separated the Christian truth from the Hindu truth from this and felt proud about what Hindus have done or Christians have done and so on. And there have been more religious wars than even wars about territory or property. So it becomes completely a travesty of anything that can be called religious. So Krishnaji insisted that we must free ourselves from all this conditioning and all this division. Otherwise, learning does not even begin. It's not that this is the end of learning. He says it's the beginning of learning, because otherwise, your conditioning is constantly distorting your perceptions, and what you perceive is not the truth, but it is the truth relative to your conditioning. That's not the absolute truth. So all these difficulties exist in the religious quest, but it is far more important to engage in the religious quest than in the scientific quest. Because knowledge of the world, whether you have it or not, it doesn't affect too much. But if you don't have self-knowledge, which is the aim of the religious quest, then you don't have wisdom. And knowledge without wisdom becomes dangerous, becomes destructive. And we have created wars and weapons of destruction and so on. One can study that, what has happened. It's all on account of this lopsided development of the human mind. So in that lecture on education on 12th June, which Rohan just announced, we will go into this about how education can be transformed so as to create a mind which is both religious and scientific. Because there is no contradiction at the inquiry level. There is contradiction only when you take religion to mean belief. Then science will not accept belief. And this division, unfortunately, has had serious consequences because all over the world, we have completely thrown out religious inquiry in education. We have promoted only the scientific inquiry, and that has resulted in the lopsided development of the human mind, which is responsible for all the problems that we are seeing both in our personal life and in the world out there. So I will end it here, and maybe we can have some discussion if we have time. Already, yeah, we have 20 minutes left. So we can have some discussion, and if time is insufficient, we will conduct the discussion first thing in the morning tomorrow, because tomorrow's topic, I don't have to speak too much. I'll probably speak for half an hour, and we have time there, much more time for discussion. So if some questions are left over, we will take them up tomorrow morning. But we have 20 minutes now, so please put your questions in chat. As already I see that 19 observations are there in chat. Maybe Rohan can look at them and ask me the questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Anchanji was asking earlier, is choiceless awareness and a method of religious inquiry?
It's really not a method, because a method usually means some technique which you willfully practice. It is just a state of being. It is what one would call the witness consciousness. That means you are not trying to interfere in the phenomenon which you are observing. In the religious quest, that phenomenon being your own consciousness. You're not trying to interfere. You're not trying to change it. You are just observing in order to understand what is taking place, and maybe a few questions as to how the disorder arises in your consciousness. Unless you watch deeply, you don't come upon the truth, because these truths cannot be described, because they are not very concrete. They are nebulous. They are, you need a lot of discernment to discern what is true and what is false. Often they are very close together. For example, love appears like attachment. It's very close together. But in love, there is no ego, and in attachment, there is ego. Similar things are there. So that's why Krishnamurti talked about the art of living. The art is to find the right place of everything, not simply a definition that you must have this, you must not have that, and so on. So it's not like an engineering drawing. You can't draw lines and say this is up to here, it is a wish, now it becomes desire, or up to here it is need, and after this it becomes greed. You will have to find out those lines for yourself through perception. And that is why you need this choiceless awareness, because if you interfere with the phenomena, you are bringing in all your conditioning about what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, and that colors your reactions and maintains the ego. So this inquiry itself has to be free from the ego, which means free from the observer, or the desires and wishes of the observer.
Sir, Parth Singh ji is asking, what is consciousness and is it different from memory?
Yes, Memory is what is contained in the brain as a programming. So the programming of the Hindu is different from the programming of the Muslim and so on. And all that is held in his brain. Consciousness is something which is more holistic. It includes the brain and its inputs, but it also includes all the senses. It includes possibility for awareness and creativity, uh, the whole gamut of whatever takes place in your inner world of your consciousness. That whole thing, Krishna said, consciousness is its content. Consciousness as we know it is its content. Once you are free from the content, then it has a totally different significance. It's a consciousness of a totally different dimension. That is what liberation or mukti means.
So Umiji is asking a interesting question. She is saying, how does the act of observation affects the state of electron particles? How can we say that time and space of a single continuum when we see it differently?
This was discovered in quantum mechanics. Like I mentioned, that a particle has both the wave aspect and the particle aspect. So if you set up experiments to study the particle, then it reveals the particle aspect. If you set up experiments to understand the wave aspect, then it reveals its wave aspect. So some scientists have said that the observer is determining what the entity, namely the electron, how it will behave and what it will do. But not all scientists agree with that. But there is that place where they say it is the consciousness observing that collapses the wave function. The wave function is a mathematical function which describes both these aspects, the wave aspect and the particle aspect. And it collapses into one of the two, depending on what the consciousness is trying to observe. So that is the only place where consciousness enters into physics. Otherwise, physics is completely independent of consciousness. And they don't really understand what consciousness is, because their belief, and it's a belief, most scientists accept this belief that matter is primary and that everything else arose as an epiphenomenon. That means when the matter came into a particular configuration, then it started having life. So life is a byproduct of matter. And similarly, when evolution brought the matter to a certain level in the brain, it created consciousness. That's what the scientists believe, not all scientists. There are many scientists who differ from that and who say, no, consciousness is not a property of matter. It is something independent and that it existed even before, and that it has directed the phenomena of the development of the universe. So there are these two views, and it is still an open question. But dogmatic scientists who believe only in science assert that the rest is all nonsense. Only thing that is known to science is a fact. The other is not fact. It's called scientism. These are extremist scientists. then there are more liberal scientists like David Bohm and so on, who are willing to explore, go beyond. And that's what I mentioned, that they have created the Galileo Commission, which is wanting to investigate consciousness scientifically, not deny it, not deny its existence. But the hardcore scientists, they deny the existence of consciousness. They say there is only brain and mind, which is in operation with the as a product of the brain. So that's where those differing views are still there. And a lot of exploration is going on in this field, because right now we don't really know how life arose, and we don't really know how consciousness came into existence.
Thank you, sir. Sumitra ji is saying that she found deep learning in your talk, and she has a question. What about the Benson ring and Capra's vision at the beach? Would you say that true scientific inquiry emerges from inquiry about consciousness?
It was not an inquiry about consciousness. It was inquiry about the structure of benzene. So in science, you have all these questions. And when you are exploring a question and you find that your existing knowledge is unable to answer it, you begin to wonder and you stay with that question. And suddenly, mysteriously, you get a deep insight, which you need to question and you need to test out through experiment. But the mind somehow has this capacity to make a foray into the unknown, pick up a fact from there, and bring it into the field of known. So insight has a place also in scientific knowledge and development, and the greatest discoveries have all been made like that, through insight. But in the religious quest, without insight, you have ashes. The knowledge does not transform consciousness, including knowledge of all the sacred books and so on. But if you take that knowledge as a question and you explore within your own consciousness, you may come upon the perception as an insight. And that, going from the knowledge of the truth to the perception of that truth, is the pathless land, is the pathless bit. Otherwise, to the knowledge of the truth, there is a path. You can join courses and study Buddhist philosophy and what the Buddha has said or what Jesus Christ has said and so on. There is a path to your knowledge, but there is no path to insight. Insight has no causation. It comes to a learning mind which is curious, wondering, not attached too much to the known. Then it's a mysterious process by which this happens. All great discoveries in art, in music, in science have all come like that. I think it was Beethoven or Mozart who said, I don't think out my music. I just tune my mind and the music flows through me. He never accepted ownership of the music. And Krishnamurti said a similar thing about his own teaching. He said, I have not thought out the teaching. It comes to me like a revelation. You can read it in Mary Latience's book. I'm not making this up. He said that. He said, it's not my own teaching. And the teaching is not in the book. So you have to also come upon that insight. Only then you know the truths that Krishnamurti is talking about. Otherwise, you only have the idea about that truth, and that idea is based on your conditioning. So it is not the truth. In any case, we will have a lecture about what is religious truth. And there I will point out that religious truth is not just a correct idea.
Sir, Gayatri ji is saying, in your presentation, you mentioned that the scientific inquiry, in that the reality is unknown. And whereas K insisted on understanding reality. In other words, he says, understand what is and then go beyond. Please throw light on K's greatness on this backdrop.
Understand what is merely means you are simply observing what is taking place in your consciousness. It may be anger, it may be illusion, it may be jealousy, it may be greed. That is what is. But the inquiry then is, from where does this arise and whether that is true? That means whether it's a fact of nature or my own mind is constructing it. That's the inquiry of self-knowledge. So that requires you to explore beyond. So that's why he says you have to go beyond. That's how I have understood what he has said. But I cannot claim that that is exactly what he meant.
Sir, Srinivasa Sarma is asking how to amalgamate these two sides of scientific and religious approaches. Sir. He's saying that they are sides of the same coin. So how to amalgamate them in the present times?
Well, I pointed out that, no, that the spirit, namely the approach in both the cases is similar. Non-acceptance of authority, seeking perception, doing experiments, which is relying on observation, doubting all conclusions, not collecting the conclusions in as your knowledge, which would condition your future perceptions. So there are these parallels at the level of the spirit, but the method, the scientific method is not applicable. You can't make a model of consciousness and then test it. You can't measure consciousness. Can you measure how much you love your wife or whether you love her at all? There is no measure. There is no measure of anger. So the scientific method cannot be applied, but the scientific spirit is very akin to the religious spirit, provided you understand the differences between the two. The difference is that, as we said, the interference of the observer in the observed is much greater in the religious quest. So you need to be free of the observer. In the scientific quest, you don't have to be free from the observer. It doesn't matter who the observer is. The observer is simply eliminated.
So this may be a segue into a last question that we have time for. So Sam is asking, well, he has a comment first that your slide on scientific 10 values indicates a process, and a process is subject to time, therefore limited. It is also said none of the knowledge is completely certain. And he says that this all is mellifluous. I think he means by that melodious. It sounds good. And he's saying, I'm occupied with making a living. How can I trust my observation in scientific inquiry, knowing my observation is conditioned?
Well, publish it, and other people will repeat the experiment and point out your faults and errors. and listen to it with respect. That's exactly how the international dialogue goes on. So that a scientist may make a mistake, even Einstein made mistakes, and other people have corrected that. He never believed in quantum mechanics. His famous statement is, God does not play dice. And Bohr answered him saying, don't try to tell God what to think. Since there is no dichotomy at the spirit level, at the consciousness level, between the state of mind that is required for doing scientific inquiry and the state of mind that is required to do religious inquiry, that's why they are compatible. You can have a mind that is both scientific and religious at the same time. That means you can be knowledgeable in science and you can also have love, compassion, and virtue in your consciousness. There is no contradiction between the two. But you have to actually come upon that state. It is not, it's easy to talk about it.
Yes, sir. We have a couple of minutes more. Would you like to add some closing remarks for today?
No, I think it's fine with me. And if there are still questions, people can put them in the chat and we can take them up tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Huh? Yeah. Also, I want to add that if you read my chapter, I have myself raised a lot of questions at the end of the chapter because I have said that if there are two parallel quests in two complementary aspects of a single reality, then there must be overlapping areas between the two which are of interest to both. And so I have tried to formulate some 30, 40 questions which I feel are of interest for investigation, both by scientists and by religious people who don't exclude the inquiry into either only scientific inquiry or only the religious inquiry, and are willing to investigate more holistically into both. So do consider all those questions, and if some of those questions still you want to discuss them, we can discuss them tomorrow morning.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And this is the end of 5th session. We meet again tomorrow for the 6th one, and hope to see you all, everyone. Thank you.
It's about the art of dialogue. Yeah.
Yes, sir. We'll try to upload the session number 5 as soon as possible, as the live stream did not work today. But it may not happen by tomorrow, so apologies for that. Thank you and see you, everyone.